Hello, guys and gals, and this is part 2 of our reading of Neptune 1 is Missing. It is a novel by Hugh Walters, and as always, we're going to go over the copyright information. I'll be finding it in the book itself. Here we go. As it clearly says here, it is Neptune 1 is Missing. It's copyright 1969 by Hugh Walters. This is first American edition. All rights reserved, including the right to reproduce this book or parts thereof in any form. So we are going to continue where we left off. Let me go back to this. And in the last part, or actually the first part, we found out that something went wrong with Neptune 1 and the astronauts are presumed dead. And so now we are recapping what happened, and we're going to see. And we're going to start with this whole Neptune information. So we're going to start in the previous paragraph. Neptune is the solar planet furthest, but one from the sun. Only little Pluto circles on a more distant orbit. Neptune is large, though not as vast as the giant planets Jupiter and Saturn. Its diameter is 27,600 miles, less than a third of Jupiter's and slightly over a third of Saturn's, but it is twice as dense as its larger companions. The distance of Neptune from the sun averages about 2,800,000 miles, nearly 30 times greater than the Earth's distance. Consequently, Neptune receives far less light and heat from the sun than Earth does. One of the tasks of the expedition would be to confirm the temperature of Neptune's atmosphere, which had been calculated to be about minus 300 degrees Fahrenheit. Because of its tremendous distance, Neptune moves around the sun very slowly, taking 164 of our years to make one complete circuit. Yet the big planet spins on its axis faster than Earth, the Neptunian day being just over 15 3/4 hours. So on that cold and distant planet, a year would be about 90,000 days. Even Tony was interested in the vital statistics of the place they were about to visit. Because of a hair-raising adventure when exploring Jupiter, he was anxious to know the strength of the planet's pole. He remembered how their spaceship had almost been dragged down by the tremendous gravity of the giant. He was told that at the surface, Neptune's gravity is about 1.5 times that of Earth. Thus, a 168-pound man would find his weight increased to 216 pounds if he tried to walk about the surface of Neptune. For the same reason, a spaceship would require far more power to escape from Neptune than it would from Earth. Serge asked if Neptune had any moons, and the astronomer replied that the planet had 2 satellites. One of them, called Triton, is considerably larger than our moon. In size, Triton is midway between Venus and Mars. It may have an atmosphere, and one of the objectives of the expedition was to see if it has. How far away from the planet is it? Maury asked, and he was told that it is about the same distance from Neptune as the moon is from Earth. Will we be landing on Triton? Tony asked. That I can't say, the astronomer replied. You must ask Sir George Benson. If you do, you'll certainly find gravity stronger than on the moon, though still only a third of what we experience here. Triton must look a fine object blazing away in the Neptunian sky, Serge observed, but yet the astronomer hastened to correct him. Though it's certainly much larger than the moon, he said, remember that it's vastly further away from the source of light, the sun, so I expect it will only shine very faintly compared to our satellite. What about the other moon? Chris asked. Now Nereid is very much smaller than Triton and much further away from Neptune, 3.5 million miles, in fact. I don't suppose you'll see much of it. The 4 astronomers had spent many hours learning all they could about the distant, frozen world they were soon to visit. They had peered at it through large telescopes, but because of its immense distance, they could learn very little from its mysterious image. Faint markings could be seen, but it was not known whether These were surface features or vast clouds on the planet's upper atmosphere. "We'll soon find out," Tony declared. The date for the launching was drawing nearer, and Chris and his friends, with Whiskers and Sir George, flew to Cape Kennedy. All of them were familiar with the vast facility on the coast of Florida. It was from here that they had blasted off on most of their memorable adventures. No wonder they were excited when the jet landed at the airport a few miles away. Mr. Gillanders drove them from the plane to the Cape. It was thrilling as they drew near to see the huge spaceships on their launching pads, ready to take off to the moon, to Mars, to Venus, or to some other world. To each of these, the four young men had blazed a trail. They had been the first to land on Earth's satellite, close to the spot where Lunar City now stood. Perhaps, who knows, others would follow them on this, their most distant excursion yet. They quickly settled in at the Cape, happily renewing their acquaintances with many of the scientists and technicians who had assisted with their previous launchings. Within a few hours of their arrival, they were shown the great ship which was to carry them to the boundaries of the solar system. Neptune 1 could hardly be seen standing on its launching pad, for it was enveloped by a massive steel gantry that enabled the engineers to prepare it for the voyage. There were several electric lifts in the gantry, and the astronauts used one of them to ascend to the cabin platform, where they climbed into the compartment in which they were to work, live, and sleep during their journey to the planet. They were familiar with the masses of instruments and controls around the sides of the cabin. Tony, followed by the others, walked around looking at them. Then they climbed a metal ladder to the upper compartment. This was where they would spend the long months under hypothermia. Four contour couches were the main features of the place, but unlike the couches for ordinary sleep in the cabin below, these were all metal. It was onto these gleaming beds, each shaped to fit each particular occupant, that the astronauts would climb after their immediate tasks were done. Covers would descend from the roof, and each would be sealed off while the temperature was reduced. Not until the correct time would the covers be lifted and the temperature raised. A complicated but strong piece of equipment would be responsible for the automatic sequence of events. Chris admired the speed and thoroughness with which preparations were being completed. Like his companions, he didn't relish a long delay at the last moment. Nothing was more trying to the nerves than a halt in the countdown once it had begun. By carefully checking each job, the engineers were trying to ensure that no final hitches occurred. These were happy and exciting days. The astronauts were looking forward to the challenge that lay ahead, and as the date of the launching drew near, the whole Cape became infected with the excitement of the four young men. On the morning of the blastoff, they all ate a hearty breakfast for their food would be very different on their journey. A truck came to pick them up for a final medical examination, and then they were taken to the preparation room. Here, Mr. Gillanders insisted that they should put on their spacesuits. As soon as the ship was in orbit, they could take off the suits, but regulations compelled them to be worn during the launch. At last, to a chorus of cheerful good wishes from everyone around, Chris, Maury, Tony, and Serge clambered aboard the van that would take them out to the launch pad. On the gantry, Sir George Benson met them and saw them installed in the cabin. The hatches were sealed, ready for the firing. The gantry was moved away, and the last seconds ticked on. Chris and his crew rested confidently on their couches, waiting for the terrific thrust that would start them on their way. Chapter 3. Here goes, Tony called. Gently at first, then increasing rapidly, the thrust built up. The astronauts felt their bodies pressed down onto the carefully molded couches. Uh, it was an experience which they had which they had been through hundreds of times before, either on space trips or as passengers in one of the giant centrifuges. Yet they were always relieved when the ordeal was over. It was during these first critical moments that there was the greatest danger of something going wrong with the ship. Neptune 1 carried hundreds of tons of highly explosive propellants and a dangerous atomic motor, so that any disaster would have been of unimaginable magnitude. No wonder, then, that the astronauts breathed sighs of relief when they felt the thrust die away, indicating that the ship had gone into its orbit some 250 miles above the Earth. First stage over, Tony called as he released his straps. He propelled himself across the cabin with a gentle push, for they were now in a condition of zero gravity or free fall. Even experienced astronauts, such as the present crew, took a few moments to get used to the exhilarating state of weightlessness. Tony usually found this period a chance to let off steam. Maury joined him, and the pair of them went into the contortions of a fantastic floating ballet. Come on, you two, Chris grinned. There's work to do. Reluctantly, the dancers stopped, and they all removed their suits and helmets. Chris couldn't help reflecting how much more comfortable space journeys were now. In the very early days, astronauts were compelled to remain suited for the whole of the voyage. Now they needed only don the somewhat clumsy spacesuits when about to take off or land, or of course for excursions outside the ship on some of the strange worlds they had visited. What would Neptune really be like, Chris wondered. Intensely cold, of course, swirling with a poisonous atmosphere, perhaps subject to violent electrical storms. Would there be a surface to land upon? And if so, would they be able to penetrate deep enough through the atmosphere to touch down? With a jerk, he recalled himself and his companions to their present tasks. First, they must report to Control that all was well, and that the takeoff had been uneventful. Then they would have to carry out a long series of observations to enable the scientists on Earth to pilot their exact orbit. Of course, terrestrial observers could estimate this fairly accurately from their own observations, but for the degree of exactitude required, it was essential for the crew to cooperate. They would also be taking routine readings of radiation at many different wavelengths, paying special attention to solar radiation that could be dangerous. Each went about his own special job, with Chris reporting frequently to Control. Sir George Benson's voice came through several times on the radio and told them that he was satisfied with events so far. At last, the huge computer at the Cape had digested sufficient information to plot an exact course, and now the crew were waiting to be told when they must break orbit and leave the Earth altogether. It was Mr. Gillander's voice that gave them their final instructions. Chemical rocket motor will be ignited. Thrust force 3, duration 58 seconds in 2 minutes, 30 seconds from now. Alongside the spaceship's chronometer was the countdown instrument. This recorded the number of minutes and seconds left before zero, and Chris quickly set it, going in accordance with the instructions he'd received. All 4 astronauts retired to their couches, but there was no need to suit up or attach any safety straps. They watched the ever-changing figures of the countdown while Chris fingered the switch at his side that would awaken the giant rocket motor to life. He'd set the dial to force 3. Now it only wanted Now it only wanted the pressure of his thumb to start them on the journey to Neptune. 10 seconds, 9, 8, the four young men wondered silently what the expedition would be like. 3, 2, 1, 0. As the line of zeros clicked into place along the dial, Chris pressed. Though he knew it didn't need much force, he found himself pressing until it hurt his thumb. The motor burst into life, and the crew felt the steady pressure beneath them. Chris kept his eyes on the fleeting figures of the second counter. Already 25 seconds had slipped by since he pressed the switch. By common consent, all four remained quiet, allowing Chris to concentrate on the vital task. A fraction of a second too soon or too late would make quite a difference to the direction of their flight path. Though an error could be corrected later, it was a point of professional pride to get on target first time. Failure to do this usually resulted in some good-humored sarcasm from control. Chris's thumb trembled on the switch, a second pressure of which would stop the motor instantly. 57, 58, press. Was he just a fraction of a second too late? Chris wondered. This, as weightless again, he suddenly floated up from his couch. Traveling at nearly 60,000 miles an hour, it was easy to calculate the difference that even a fifth of a second would make. And the error would increase every moment that the ship followed its faulty flight path. It would be some minutes before control would come through and say how successful he'd been. To cover up a slight anxiety, which he was reluctant to admit to himself, Chris gave a few brisk orders to his companions. Serge and Maury were to begin preparations for switching on the ion drive of the atomic motor. Tony had the fuel supply and numerous gauges to check. As his companions floated about on their jobs, he drummed his fingers impatiently on the casing of some intricate mechanism. Not too bad, only 1 minute, 10 seconds out. The voice of Billy Gillanders boomed over the radio. It took Chris only a moment to realize that Sir George's deputy was referring to a slight error in direction rather than a colossal mistake in time. Not bad. It was very good, he told himself with satisfaction. Any error of less than 5 minutes, that is 1/12 of a degree, was quite an achievement. He called out the good news to his companions, and for a moment Tony wondered what it all meant. Ah, yes. A circle is divided by 360 degrees, he remembered. On the Earth's surface, a degree is about 69 miles. Degrees can be divided into 60 minutes. Down to the ground, a second is about 300 yards. Strictly speaking, one should refer to minutes or seconds of arc when speaking of fractions of a circle. This avoids confusion with units of time, Tony told himself, but Mr. Gillander knew that Chris would understand what he meant. It certainly wasn't a bad effort. Neptune 1 would be able to speed through space for 2 days before a further refinement in course would be necessary. Meanwhile, the crew must prepare to switch over to the atomic motor. The atomic motor had been another great help in space travel. Before its development, ships had to rely on heavy and bulky fuels. Though many powerful chemicals had been discovered, they still limited the payload and range of vessels depending on chemical rocket motors. With the help of the ion drive of atomic motors, fantastic velocities could be achieved, but the new form of propulsion had disadvantages as well as advantages. And as Serge went about his duties, he wondered if any further means of space travel would ever be discovered. He believed that the weakness of the thrust of an ion drive was far outweighed by the ability to run almost indefinitely. Though the atomic motor could never lift a ship from the ground, once escape velocity had been reached, its steady pull could continue to accelerate the vehicle until almost two-thirds of the speed of light had been achieved. Now that they, not that they would travel that fast, Surge knew, but perhaps it would be necessary when man came to venture beyond the solar system. There were several hours work to get ready for the switchover. Tony, as the expedition mechanic, was in charge of the operation, and his instructions about shielding fuel rods, and the liquid caesium bottles were clear and precise. At last the job was done, and Chris reported this to the Cape. A careful time check was made, and the signal was given. Tony pulled the lever that lowered the last fuel rod into position, and so made the motor critical. At once, the feeling of weightlessness vanished. Each of the astronauts again had a sense of up and down. Previously, under zero gravity, this hadn't existed. Only because they were familiar with the layout of the cabin had the astronauts any idea which way they were moving. Now, there was no doubt which was their floor. The gentle thrust that was nudging the ship along at its ever-increasing velocity provided a low gravity. It was about 1/6 of terrestrial gravity, or approximately the same as that on the moon. The astronauts had spent long periods on Earth's satellite, and so were quite used to working under such conditions. In many ways, the low gravity was preferable to weightlessness, for now articles could be left loose in the cabin. They wouldn't float about disconcertingly anymore. Eating and drinking, too, were simpler, for they needn't squeeze tubes as they would for a long, weightless journey. Chris reported to control that the atomic motor was functioning normally and that he could detect no undue amount of radiation in the cabin. A few seconds later, control requested that regular readings should be made on the Geiger counters, for it would be during the first few hours that the shielding of the cabin would receive the most severe test. If the radiation from the motor showed no increase during that time, they could settle down to their long journey without any anxiety. The time lag in sending messages and getting reply was becoming noticeable. As the ship drew further away from the Earth, this would increase. Even though radio waves, like light, travel at 186,000 miles per second, the ship was now so far along its path that it took 2 seconds for a signal to reach the Cape, and of course another 2 seconds were lost as the reply sped back. A feeling of isolation would increase in proportion to the time lag. The crew remembered how lonely they had felt when, on some of their more distant journeys, it had taken several hours to consult control. With their immediate tasks complete, Chris and his companions could settle into the routine they would follow until the time came for them to transfer to the fridge, ready for their long sleep. Of course, there were exercises to do. An important part of an astronaut's routine is to carry out a number of well-planned exercises designed to keep all his muscles toned up. Under conditions of low or zero gravity, the crew of the spaceship soon found that they were losing strength because their muscles had little or no work to do. They rapidly became flabby. This was not important so long as they remained weightless, or almost so, but it became very serious when they returned to normal conditions. Without these exercises, an astronaut returning from a long space voyage would be completely helpless under conditions of terrestrial gravity. He would have no more strength than a baby, and he would experience the utmost difficulty even in breathing. Chris and the others understood the importance of carrying out these exercises, which were useful, also because they gave the crew something to do. On a long space trip, one of the greatest enemies is boredom. For there are few exciting moments and little work except routine observations. The exercises were a welcome part of their work and were planned very ingeniously. Can we all turn in now, Chris? Maury asked after they had completed their physical jerks and had a good rub down. Yeah, I think so, Chris agreed. There was little point in leaving one of their number on watch, for the only hazard they were likely to encounter was a stray meteorite. Impacts with very small ones caused no trouble, for a penetration of the outer skin could be sealed up automatically. Once, when they were a half an inch in diameter or larger, would only when they were a half an inch in diameter or larger would meteorites cause real trouble, and they would penetrate. Then they would penetrate to the cabin or fuel tanks. But this was so unlikely that the possibility could be forgotten. The four young men settled down in their contour couches, for it was more than 18 hours since they had blasted off from the Cape, and nearly 24 hours since they had left their beds on Earth. Chris told Control that they were all going off duty and promised to report as soon as the new quote-unquote day started. Control gave the okay, for the crew could always be aroused by a buzzer set off from Earth. Maury dimmed the lights in the cabin. I'm going to have a look outside before I go to sleep, he said, getting up from the couch. While the others lay back quietly, Maury went across to the observation panel and pressed the switch that would cause that part of the outer casing to slide back. Through the thick glass panel in front of him, he peered out into the void. The sun was shining on the other side of the ship. Otherwise, he would have been blinded by its glare. On Earth, we are protected by a thick layer of atmosphere, which, however clear, still filters out a great deal of the sun's radiation. In space, the full solar blast was falling on the ship. It would not be until they were almost at the end of their journey that the astronauts would be able to observe the sun directly. Though he'd seen it many times before, the vision of space never failed to make Maury catch his breath. Innumerable points of brilliant light shone unwinkingly from every direction. He knew that the void itself, not having the power to reflect light, would be like black velvet, but there were so many stars that he scarcely saw a black patch at all. The largest object he could see was, of course, the Earth. This, a pearly green, was about as large as an orange, and he could also see a slim crescent of the moon. Blazing away from another direction was the ruddy planet of Mars, while the lordly Jupiter, some of its attendant moons just visible, dominated another part of the field of view. The others were all fast asleep, and Maury, with a sigh, closed the outer casing and tore himself away from the panel. Space is indescribably lovely, Maury thought to himself as he closed his eyes, but also ruthlessly cruel. Check here. Well, we need to stop here. We did make it to chapter 4, though, so we've been reading from Neptune 1 is Missing. It is a book by Hugh Walters. If you like this content, then make sure you like and subscribe and ring the bell so you know when I upload. Also, if you want to support me in any way, or if you want to join the Discord server, all that information will be in the description below. As always, thanks for watching, everyone, and have a great day.